Blind since 17 and still unmarried at 29, Ravella's laughter sliced across the candlelit ballroom while crystal glasses chimed between gloved fingers around the long dining table. Honestly, Father, at this point we should simply find Thessaly a position at a charitable workhouse. At least there her sewing might serve some practical purpose. Soft laughter rippled through the guests. Thessaly sat perfectly still, her sightless eyes fixed somewhere beyond the noise, her hands folded carefully in her lap, while humiliation pressed against her chest like a heated stone. Then Fiora rose from her chair with a dramatic flourish, the rustle of her silk gown sweeping across the polished floor. "Oh, Thessaly, you simply must feel my engagement ring. Since you cannot admire it properly, perhaps your clever little fingers will appreciate what your eyes cannot." The youngest sister seized Thessaly's wrist without warning and pressed her hand roughly against the enormous diamond sitting on her finger. Several guests gasped softly. Others covered their smiles behind gloved hands. Pemberton spent nearly £6,000 on it. Can you feel how large the stone is? Though I suppose jewelry holds little meaning for someone who will never wear a wedding band of her own. It feels beautiful, Fiora. Truly. Thessaly's voice remained steady despite the tremor building deep inside her throat. "Do not be pitiful, sister," Malus added lazily, from across the table, swirling her wineglass between her fingers. "Perhaps some kind old clergyman might still take her. Blind wives ask fewer questions about where their husbands wander at night." Laughter erupted louder now. Even guests who shifted uncomfortably still smiled along. Lord Everard Greyborn lifted his glass slowly and waited until the ballroom quieted beneath the weight of his authority. "Every daughter of this house has brought distinction to the Greyborn name." His voice carried the cold certainty of iron dragged across stone. Then his gaze drifted deliberately toward Thessaly. She would never see the contempt in his expression, but every person in the room could. All but one. Silence crashed across the ballroom like a door slamming shut. Thessaly felt the heat of every stare pressing against her skin. She heard breathing tighten around her. She heard a fork placed down too carefully against porcelain. She heard the rustle of someone leaning forward to study her reaction. Humiliation burned through her face down her throat and settled like a weight inside her chest while her fingers gripped the edge of the tablecloth until her knuckles whitened beneath the fabric. And just as she began pushing her chair backward to leave, the enormous ballroom doors groaned open against the marble floor. A servant's voice boomed across the estate with unmistakable authority. "His Grace, Duke Cassian Renwick of Ashenmoor." The entire ballroom fell completely silent. But before we continue, if you enjoy emotional stories filled with betrayal, heartbreak, jealousy, and powerful vindication, make sure you like this video and subscribe to the channel. And if you truly want to support us, you can use super thanks below. Your support helps us continue creating these unforgettable stories for you every single day. Now let us continue. The needle never lied to Thessaly Greyborn. Sunlight meant nothing to her anymore. Colors existed only as memories fading slowly, like old perfume pressed into forgotten cloth. But thread and fabric told her everything she needed to know through her fingertips. She could feel the difference between French silk and English cotton before her fingers had traveled more than an inch across the surface. She could count stitches by touch faster than most seamstresses could count them with their eyes open. She could detect the tension of a crooked seam the way a musician hears a single instrument slightly out of tune inside an entire orchestra. And every beautiful gown her sisters wore to every ballroom, every dinner, every gathering that filled Greyborn Hall with perfumed laughter and champagne belonged to her hands. Nobody ever said so. The sewing room sat at the far end of the east corridor on the 3rd floor, distant enough from the main halls that guests never accidentally wandered past it. The walls smelt faintly of lavender oil and linseed, and Thessaly had memorized every surface inside the room with the patience of someone who understood that certainty lived in her fingers, not her eyes. 42 steps from her bedroom door. 12 steps from the corridor wall to the wooden chair beside the window. She could no longer see through. 4 steps from the chair to the cabinet, where she kept her needles organized by thickness, inside small linen pouches she had sewn herself. Each morning before the household stirred, Thessaly dressed in the same plain gray wool dress and walked carefully to the sewing room, trailing her fingertips along the corridor wall to guide herself. She worked for hours in complete silence while the estate slowly woke around her. Downstairs, servants prepared breakfast trays while Lady Sinara reviewed invitations at the dining table. Lord Everard read business correspondence in his study. Her 3 younger sisters slept comfortably beneath embroidered blankets until well past 10. Nobody checked on her. Nobody brought her tea. Nobody thanked her when the finished garments were collected from her room each evening. One particular morning, while stitching a delicate pearl border along the bodice of a gown Fiora had demanded for an upcoming supper, Thessaly heard footsteps approaching from the far end of the corridor. She recognized the rhythm instantly. Brindley walked with a slight unevenness because of the old injury in her left ankle, and she always hesitated briefly before knocking. "Come in, Brindley." The maid entered carrying warm bread and a cup of broth. "You have not eaten since yesterday afternoon, miss. I needed to finish the hemwork before this evening. Your fingers are bleeding again." Thessaly tucked her hands beneath the fabric instinctively. "It is nothing." Brindley set the tray down gently beside the window and stood watching for a moment. "That gown is extraordinary, miss. The pearl spacing alone would take any London dressmaker weeks. Fiora needs it by Thursday." "And will Miss Fiora mention who made it?" Thessaly smiled faintly, but said nothing. They both already knew the answer. That afternoon, while resting her hands briefly in the drawing room, Thessaly overheard a conversation drifting through the open doorway from the parlor. Lady Whitmore, a frequent guest, was admiring Ravella's new evening gown. "Absolutely exquisite needlework, Lady Torrance. Wherever did you find such a talented dressmaker?" Ravella answered without hesitation. "A private seamstress in Mayfair. Terribly expensive, but worth every penny for craftsmanship like this." Thessaly's fingers tightened around the arm of her chair. She had spent 11 days on that gown. Her fingertips still carried small cuts from the silver, threading along the collar, and her own sister had erased her from it entirely. She said nothing. She never did. During gatherings, Thessaly moved through Greybourne Hall like a ghost passing between rooms. Guests rarely noticed her unless they needed something, and even then they frequently mistook her for household staff. Her plain dresses blended into the background beside the vivid silks and jeweled fabrics her sisters wore. She navigated the estate by memory and sound, counting footsteps along corridors, listening for the creak of specific floorboards near doorways, and using the faint warmth of fireplaces to orient herself inside larger rooms. Nobody offered her a seat at the main table anymore. Nobody introduced her when visitors arrived. When wealthy families brought eligible sons for dinner, Lady Sinara quietly arranged for Thessaly to eat in the morning room instead. It avoids awkward questions. Her mother had explained once without looking directly at her. The cruelty was rarely loud. It lived in the silences, in the conversations that stopped when she entered rooms, in the invitations addressed only to her sisters, in the way Lord Everard spoke about 3 daughters instead of 4 whenever business associates asked about his family. But the servants saw everything. One cold evening, while Thessaly carefully descended the back staircase, carrying a basket of finished alterations, she heard quiet sobbing coming from the storage alcove beneath the steps. She stopped immediately and tilted her head, listening. "Who is there?" a small, frightened voice answered. "It is Nell, miss. Please do not tell anyone." Thessaly knelt slowly beside the alcove entrance, setting the basket aside. Nell was barely 13, the youngest kitchen maid, brought to the estate only 2 months earlier after her mother died of fever. "What happened, sweetheart?" "I dropped a serving dish during polishing, and it cracked against the stone. Mrs. Pembury said she would have my wages docked for the entire month." The child's voice broke with terror. I cannot lose my wages, miss. My younger brother depends on what I send home. Thessaly reached forward gently until her fingers found the girl's trembling shoulder. Which dish was it? The blue and white one with the painted flowers near the rim, the Staffordshire. I know that dish, by touch. There are 14 of them in the collection, and Lord Greybourne has not counted the china himself in over a decade. Listen to me, carefully. Take the broken pieces and wrap them inside cloth. Bring them to my sewing room tomorrow morning before Mrs. Pembury inspects the cabinet. I will handle the rest. But miss, if they discover, they will not. I have rearranged that cabinet before, and nobody noticed, because nobody counts what they assume will always be there. Your wages are safe, Nell. Now dry your face and go finish your duties before anyone asks questions. The girl's breathing slowly steadied. Then small arms wrapped suddenly around Thessaly's neck in a fierce hug that nearly knocked her sideways. Thank you, miss. You are the only person in this house who is kind. Thessaly held the child gently for a moment before releasing her. Go on, now quickly. After the girl's footsteps disappeared down the corridor, Thessaly remained kneeling in the dark alcove for several seconds. Not because she could not find her way back, but because kindness received from a frightened child somehow hurt more than cruelty received from her own family. Nobody upstairs would ever know about this. Nobody upstairs ever knew about any of it. Greybourne Hall erupted into chaos the morning Lady Sonara announced Ravella's engagement to Viscount Hadwin Torrance. Carriages arrived daily for weeks, carrying crates of imported flowers from Holland, bolts of cream-colored silk from Paris, cases of crystal champagne glasses from London, and enormous silver candelabras polished until they reflected entire rooms in miniature. The kitchens burned through firewood at twice the normal rate, while cooks prepared sample dishes for Lady Sonara's approval. Roasted quail, honeyed lamb, sugared violet pastries, poached salmon dressed with dill and lemon butter, and towering cakes layered with marzipan and candied orange peel filled the long preparation tables from dawn until well past midnight. Every conversation inside the manor revolved around Ravella. Lady Sonara spent entire afternoons adjusting seating arrangements and arguing with florists about centerpiece heights. Lord Everard boasted about the Torrance family's political connections to every visitor willing to listen. Musicians arrived 4 days before the celebration and practiced waltzes beneath the painted ballroom ceilings until the melodies became background noise drifting through every corridor. Meanwhile, Thessaly worked. Lady Sonara assigned her the engagement gown itself, knowing privately that no London dressmaker could produce finer needlework at such short notice. The gown required ivory satin overlaid with hand-stitched lace along the bodice, sleeves gathered with silk ribbon, and over 300 tiny seed pearls sewn individually across the skirt. Thessaly worked 16 hours a day inside the sewing room. Her fingers ached constantly. Twice she pricked herself deeply enough to bleed through the fabric and was forced to re-stitch entire sections in the dark silence of early morning. Beyond the gown, she supervised table arrangements by feeling the spacing of every plate and glass with her hands. She resolved a dispute between the head gardener and the florist by suggesting a compromise neither had considered. She calmed 2 overwhelmed kitchen maids who had burned an entire batch of pastry cream the night before the celebration. She organized guest bedroom linens by counting thread density with her fingertips to ensure the finest sheets went to the most important visitors. By the morning of the engagement dinner, exhaustion sat so heavily beneath her skin that her hands trembled while threading her needle. Yet not a single member of the family thanked her, not once. Ravella swept through the manor as though the celebration existed solely to worship her. The engagement gown, which Thessaly had nearly destroyed her fingers completing, shimmered beneath the candlelight as Ravella turned before mirrors, surrounded by admiring guests. Diamond earrings dangled beside her jawline while maids adjusted her gloves every few minutes. The lace along the left sleeve feels slightly uneven, Ravella complained while passing Thessaly in the corridor without stopping. Honestly, if you cannot manage stitching properly, Perhaps we should have ordered from London after all." Thessaly said nothing. She simply returned to the sewing room and corrected an imperfection so small that no sighted person would have noticed it. By evening, the estate overflowed with guests. Noble women in embroidered gowns glided through the ballroom, while gentlemen gathered beside fireplaces, discussing horse racing and parliamentary gossip. Silver trays carried by nervous servants offered roasted pheasant, glazed root vegetables, smoked trout on toast, sugared almonds, and tiny glasses of elderflower cordial between courses of wine. Thessaly stood near the far wall beside the musicians, listening to conversations she was not invited to join. An elderly countess approached her with a warm voice. "You must be one of Lord Greybourne's daughters. What a lovely face. Tell me, dear, when shall we celebrate your engagement?" Before Thessaly could answer, another woman nearby whispered just loudly enough to be heard, "She is the blind one. Surely you noticed." A brief, horrible silence followed. "Oh, Bast, forgive me, my dear. I did not realize." The pity in that voice cut deeper than any insult. Thessaly excused herself quietly and moved toward the edge of the room, counting her steps carefully to avoid bumping into anyone, though her hands were shaking. The humiliation sharpened during dinner. Wavella sat proudly beside Viscount Hadwin while guests raised their glasses in toast after toast. Hadwin charmed the table effortlessly with stories about fox hunts and country estates, though Thessaly noticed something nobody else seemed to hear. Twice during quieter moments, his breathing changed when servants refilled his wineglass. The rhythm of someone drinking, not for pleasure but for need. She also caught fragments of a whispered conversation between Hadwin and another gentleman near the fireplace. Something about outstanding debts at a racing club in Newmarket and a payment deadline that had already passed. Worry settled inside her chest, but Ravella heard nothing except compliments. When dessert arrived, Lady Sonara quietly instructed Thessaly to help distribute plates because 2 servants had fallen behind during the final course. As Thessaly carefully placed lemon tarts before guests, relying on the edge of the table and the position of water glasses to guide her hands, Malus spoke loudly enough for the entire table to hear. "Do be careful, sister. If you drop one, nobody will blame you. After all, expectations for the blind are naturally lower." Several guests laughed uncomfortably. One woman looked down at her plate. Nobody said a word in Thessaly's defense. Then Ravella added, leaning into the laughter, "Though I must say, serving food may be the closest Thessaly ever comes to hosting a dinner table of her own." This time the laughter traveled further across the ballroom. Lady Sonara caught Thessaly's arm beneath the table and whispered sharply, "Smile. Do not make a scene." Thessaly nodded. She smiled. She continued serving dessert, while something inside her chest folded slowly inward like cloth being pressed flat beneath a heavy iron. Hours later, long after the final guest departed and the music faded into silence, Thessaly sat alone inside her sewing room with the door locked. Her fingers rested motionless on the unfinished fabric in her lap. She did not cry. She had stopped crying at gatherings years ago. Instead, she simply sat in the darkness that was always there, listening to the empty house settle around her, and wondered whether anyone in her family would notice if she disappeared entirely. A soft knock interrupted the silence. Brinley entered, carrying a cup of warm chamomile sweetened with honey. "I thought you might not sleep tonight." "I am fine, Brinley." "No, miss, you are being brave. Those are very different things." Thessaly's composure nearly broke hearing those words. She pressed her lips together tightly and nodded once without speaking. Brinley set the cup beside her hand, close enough for Thessaly to find by touch without reaching. "The gown was perfect tonight, every stitch. You should know that, even if nobody else tells you." After Brinley left, Thessaly sat holding the warm cup between both palms until the heat faded completely. The heat slowly faded, but she did not drink. She simply held it because it was the only warmth anyone had offered her all day. 3 weeks later, the wedding took place beneath heavy gray skies. Crowds gathered along the church path while Ravella stepped into her carriage wrapped in white fur and winter lace, smiling radiantly as Lord Everard stood proudly beside the stone steps. Thessaly stood further back near the iron gate, holding her gloves tightly against the cold. The departing carriage remained invisible to her, but she heard the wheels grinding across the frozen gravel, growing quieter with every second. She heard the cheering fade. She heard footsteps retreat back inside the church, and standing there alone in the silence that followed, Thessaly realized something had quietly shifted inside her. Not broken. Something beyond breaking. Something simply gone. She no longer felt like she belonged to the family whose name she still carried. Long before silence became her constant companion, Thessaly Greyborn had once been the brightest voice inside Greyborn Hall. At 16, she moved through the sunlit corridors with laughter trailing behind her like music. She painted watercolors beside the garden windows during summer afternoons while butterflies drifted between the rose hedges outside. She played the pianoforte with enough skill that guests requested encores during evening gatherings, and she spoke during dinner conversations with a sharpness that surprised even Lord Everard, who privately considered her the most promising of all his daughters. But it was her needlework that truly astonished people. Even as a girl, Thessaly could embroider scenes so detailed that visitors mistook them for painted miniatures, tiny birds perched on silver branches, flowers with petals so finely stitched they seemed to move when candlelight flickered across the fabric. Lady Sonara displayed her daughter's work proudly inside the main drawing room, and more than once wealthy women offered significant money to commission pieces directly. Thessaly had been the family's greatest treasure, and everyone in Northvale knew it. That was also the year Leander Ashwell first visited the estate. Leander arrived accompanying his uncle, a respected art dealer, invited by Lord Everard to appraise several paintings inside the manor's private collection. Gushed. He was 20 years old, tall and quiet. With paint-stained fingers, he tried unsuccessfully to hide inside his coat pockets during introductions. Unlike the stiff young nobleman Thessaly usually encountered, Leander carried no arrogance about him. He spoke gently, laughed easily, and looked at the world with the careful attention of someone trained to notice beauty in overlooked places. Their first conversation happened accidentally beside the gallery corridor, where Thessaly had been studying a landscape painting she wanted to replicate in embroidery. Leander stopped beside her and pointed toward a shadow in the lower corner of the canvas. Most people look at the mountains first, but the painter hid the real story down here in the way the light falls across the water. Thessaly turned toward him with surprise. I noticed that too. Nobody else ever has. Something shifted between them in that single moment. Over the following weeks, Leander returned to the estate repeatedly under the pretense of completing his uncle's appraisal work. In truth, he came for Thessaly. They spent long afternoons walking through the orchard discussing art, poetry, and the way. Colors behave differently under morning light compared to evening shadow. He sketched her portrait once beside the garden fountain, while autumn leaves collected around their feet. She embroidered a small landscape for him in return, a hillside covered in wildflowers above a winding river, and his expression when he received it told her everything words had not yet said. Thessaly felt truly seen by someone who valued her mind and her heart equally. Even Brinley noticed. "You hum while you sew now, miss. You have not done that in years." Thessaly blushed and changed the subject, but happiness radiated from her so visibly that even Lord Everard commented on her improved spirits during supper. Then the fever arrived. It began with a headache during an October evening. By morning, Thessaly could barely stand. The doctor arrived within hours and diagnosed a fever so severe that he warned the family to prepare for the worst. For 11 days, Thessaly burned with fever so intense that servants changed her soaked bedsheets 3 times each night. Brinley refused to leave her side despite Lady Sonara's warnings about contagion. The household moved in whispered terror while Thessaly drifted between consciousness and darkness. On the 12th morning, the fever finally broke. Thessaly opened her eyes slowly, expecting to see the familiar ceiling of her bedroom above her. She saw nothing. The doctor confirmed it within the hour. The fever had damaged the nerves behind her eyes beyond repair. The blindness was permanent. Thessaly remembered screaming. She remembered Brinley's arms holding her against the bed while the doctor spoke in a calm voice that felt like cruelty. She remembered her mother standing in the doorway without entering the room. She remembered her father's voice, later that evening through the bedroom wall, heavy and deliberate. "This changes everything." Those 3 words carried more weight than any diagnosis. Within weeks, the household shifted around her like furniture rearranged in a room she could no longer navigate. Lady Sonara stopped displaying Thessaly's embroidery in the drawing room. Lord Everard ceased mentioning her during conversations with guests. Her younger sisters, already jealous of the attention she had always received, grew bolder in their indifference now that her greatest advantage had been stripped away. And then there was Leander. He came to the estate the moment he received word. Thessaly heard his voice in the corridor below and felt her chest tighten with a mixture of longing and terror. He entered her bedroom gently and sat beside her in silence, so complete that she could hear his heartbeat. Then he took her hand. "This changes nothing for me," but Lord Everard had already made his decision. That evening, voices erupted from the study loud enough for servants to hear from every corridor. "She is damaged now, and you possess neither title nor fortune. I will not allow my daughter to become an object of pity hanging from the arm of a penniless artist. I love her, Lord Greybourne. That has not changed. Love does not feed noble families, and a blind wife, married beneath her station, would make this family a subject of mockery across every drawing room in England. Leave this estate tonight, and do not return." Thessaly stood trembling outside the study door, pressing both hands flat against the wood as though she could push through it by force. But the door was lost to her, along with every other shape in the world she once knew. And in that moment, her blindness felt like a cage built around her by the people who should have protected her. Leander found her the next morning beside the garden gate. Rain soaked through both of them while he held her hands between his own. "I will find a way back to you. No matter what it takes. I swear it." His carriage pulled away while Thessaly stood listening to the wheels growing distant against the gravel until the sound disappeared entirely beneath the rain. She waited for letters that never arrived. 3 months later, Brinley entered the sewing room carrying a folded note delivered by courier. Thessaly heard the hesitation in the maid's breathing before a single word was spoken. "Miss, I am so sorry." Leander had died of pneumonia contracted during winter travel through the northern counties. He had been searching for portrait commissions to build enough income to return for her. Thessaly did not scream this time. She simply sat motionless at her sewing table, while the needle slipped from her fingers and landed somewhere on the floor beyond her reach. Something behind her ribs collapsed inward, so quietly that nobody heard it happen. The girl who once painted watercolors and played pianoforte beside open windows never returned after that winter. What remained was someone quieter. Someone who kept her hands busy and her voice low, and her pain folded neatly inside where nobody would accidentally discover it. The years that followed Ravella's wedding brought 2 more engagements to Greybourne Hall, and with each one, Thessaly's place inside her own family shrank further. Malis became engaged to Lord Calder Dunmore during a winter gathering in London. Dunmore possessed enormous political influence, a severe reputation, an estate sprawling across 3 counties. Lady Sonara wept with pride when the announcement came. Lord Everard shook Dunmore's hand with the satisfied grip of a man who believed his family's position had been permanently secured. At the engagement dinner, Malis reached across the table and placed her hand gently over Thessaly's. The gesture appeared sympathetic enough for guests to admire. "You must not feel discouraged, dear sister. Marriage is not everything. Some women find purpose in other ways." The kindness was performed entirely for the audience watching. Thessaly heard the rehearsal in every syllable. Across the table, Lord Dunmore barely acknowledged his own fiancée. He spent the entire evening debating taxation reform with Lord Everard, while treating Maylis as little more than a decorative addition to the chair beside him. Twice during quieter moments, Thessaly heard Maylis attempt conversation with her future husband, only to receive clipped responses that carried the warmth of a closed ledger. Later that night, Thessaly passed the drawing room and heard Maylis speaking through the partially open door. "You did not look at me once during dinner. I was conducting important discussions. You should understand the difference between attention and neediness, Maylis." The coldness in his voice pressed against the walls like frost. Maylis fell silent immediately. Thessaly moved away before hearing more, but something troubled her deeply. She recognized the sound of a woman slowly learning that the admiration she had been promised would never arrive. Fiora's engagement came several months later, announced with the force of an explosion. Pemberton Hale, heir to one of the largest textile manufacturing fortunes in England, proposed during a private dinner at his London townhouse. Fiora returned to Greybourne Hall displaying the diamond ring with the pride of a general displaying a conquered flag. Itty prod, he owns factories in 3 cities and a shipping company. "That trades as far as India," Fiora declared while seated beside the fireplace surrounded by admiring guests. "Lady Whitmore told me she has never seen a stone that large outside of the royal collection." Lord Everard's satisfaction that evening was so visible that Thessaly could hear it in the tempo of his voice, faster, lighter, the rhythm of a man who believed his legacy had been completed. Once again the estate erupted into preparations, and once again Thessaly was buried beneath the work nobody else would do. She stitched Fiora's engagement gown from scratch. She organized guest accommodations. She directed the kitchen staff through a menu Lady Sonara had changed 4 separate times in a single week. She repaired a tear in the imported tablecloth that would have cost £15 to replace. She worked until her fingers cramped so badly that Brinley had to massage them with warm oil before Thessaly could hold a needle again. And once again, not one member of her family said thank you. During the celebration dinner, hundreds of candles illuminated the ballroom while guests consumed roasted venison with cranberry glaze, buttered asparagus, oysters served on crushed ice, honeyed parsnips, and towering chocolate tortes decorated with gold leaf. Thessaly sat at the far end of the table, positioned where important guests would not need to address her directly. Fiora raised her glass beside Pemberton. 3 successful engagements. For the Greybourne daughters. Father, you must be proud. Ravella smiled broadly. Maylis raised her glass in agreement. Several guests turned instinctively toward Thessaly. The absence of a 4th engagement hung in the air like smoke nobody wanted to acknowledge. Then Ravella spoke, and the words landed like a blade drawn slowly. 3 out of 4 is still rather impressive, would you not agree? Laughter followed. Not loud, not cruel enough for anyone to object to openly, but sharp enough for Thessaly to feel the cut beneath her ribs. "Do not look so wounded, sister," Maylis added with theatrical gentleness. "Surely your sewing brings you comfort enough." Lord Everard lifted his glass slowly. The ballroom quieted beneath the weight of his voice. "Every daughter of this house has brought distinction to the Greybourne name." His gaze drifted toward Thessaly with cold deliberation. "All but one." The silence that followed pressed against the walls like a held breath. Even Pemberton smiled before catching himself. Thessaly lowered her face toward her plate and said nothing while the sound of laughter settled around her like dust. What none of the guests understood was how quickly the shine was already fading from the marriages they toasted so proudly. Ravella's situation had worsened considerably since her wedding. Viscount Hadwin's gambling had escalated from quiet losses at racing clubs to catastrophic debts that threatened his family's estates entirely. Twice in recent months, Ravella had been forced to sell jewelry privately through a London broker to cover outstanding obligations her husband refused to acknowledge. Their arguments behind closed doors had grown loud enough that visiting servants carried whispers back to their own households. Yet in public, Ravella maintained her composure with a rigidity that fooled everyone except Thessaly, who could hear the strain tightening her sister's voice every time she mentioned Hadwin's name. Maylis fared no better in different ways. Lord Dunmore treated her with the emotional interest of a man reviewing quarterly accounts. He attended social gatherings alone whenever possible, introduced her only when protocol demanded it, and spent most evenings locked inside his study conducting political business that never included his wife's opinion. During a recent visit to Greybourne Hall, Thessaly overheard Maylis crying quietly in the upstairs guest room, while Dunmore entertained Lord Everard downstairs, without once asking where she had gone. And Fiora, still glowing with pre-wadding excitement, had already begun receiving small warnings she was too proud to recognize. Pemberton corrected her opinions in public, with a smile sharp enough to silence the table. He decided which gowns she would wear to specific events. He controlled the guest list for their own engagement dinner and removed two of Fiora's closest friends without explanation. Yet none of the sisters examined their own marriages honestly. Their frustration needed a target, and Thessaly had always been the easiest one available. But the worst came later that evening. Long after dessert had been cleared and the music had softened into background noise, Thessaly walked slowly through the upper corridor toward her sewing room when she heard her name spoken inside Lord Everard's study. She stopped immediately, pressing one hand flat against the wall to steady herself. Lady Sinara's voice carried clearly through the heavy wooden door. "Once Fiora's wedding is behind us, it may be time to consider a permanent arrangement for Thessaly. My sister Dorothea has room at her property in Cumberland. It is far enough from London that questions would eventually stop." Lord Everard was quiet for several long seconds before answering. "I agree. Her presence here has become increasingly difficult to explain. People talk, and the family cannot afford another season of whispered pity. She could continue her sewing there. It would not be unkind. It would be practical. That is what matters." Thessaly stood frozen in the corridor, her hand pressed harder against the wall, while the stone beneath her palm felt colder than it ever had before. She was not being punished. She was being erased, quietly, efficiently, and without anyone believing they were doing anything wrong. Her breathing became unsteady. She turned away from the study door and walked with deliberate care down the back staircase, through the kitchen corridor, past the servants' quarters, and out through the side entrance into the night. Cold air struck her face immediately. Rain had begun falling some time during the final course of dinner, and heavy droplets soaked through her thin wool dress within seconds. She stood motionless in the dark garden, unable to see the sky above her, unable to see the ground beneath her feet, surrounded only by the sound of rain striking stone and earth and the leaves of hedgerows she knew were somewhere beside her, and her breathing broke apart. Tears she had not allowed herself for months finally escaped, mixing with rainwater across her cheeks while her shoulders trembled violently. She pressed both hands against her mouth to keep the sound from carrying back inside the house, because even in her grief, some part of her still protected a family that had never once protected her. Then, suddenly, through the heavy curtain of rain, a different sound reached her. Carriage wheels, grinding across the front gravel drive toward Greybourne Hall. Thessaly slowly lifted her head toward the sound, rain streaming down her face, and listened. Across England, the name Cassian Renwick carried a weight that made powerful men pause before speaking in his presence. His estate stretched across the coastal counties of Auchenmoor and beyond, encompassing forests, farmlands, iron foundries, and a fleet of merchant vessels that moved cargo between England, the continent, and ports as distant as the Caribbean. His annual income exceeded that of most noble families combined. Politicians requested his counsel carefully. Bankers treated his correspondence with the reverence reserved for royalty. Even families whose titles predated his own by centuries respected the sheer force of influence the Renwick name commanded inside Parliament and London society. At 36 years old, Duke Cassian Renwick had refused every eligible woman in England. Society could not understand it. Mothers with beautiful daughters spent fortunes arranging encounters at balls, dinners, and country gatherings, only to watch the Duke acknowledge their efforts with polite indifference before departing early. Young noblewomen practiced their finest conversation, wore their most flattering gowns, and laughed at his driest remarks with exaggerated delight. None of it mattered. He treated every advance with the same courteous distance, and eventually the same question echoed through every drawing room in London. What is wrong with the Duke of Ashmore? The answer lived inside a wound nobody outside Renwick Manor fully understood. Ashmore stood on the edge of the northern cliffs, a vast stone estate overlooking black rocks and churning sea. The interior carried a permanent chill despite roaring fireplaces in every room. Dark oak corridors stretched endlessly between portraits of former Renwicks, whose painted eyes seemed to watch servants pass with silent judgment. The manor felt less like a home, and more like a monument built to contain grief. Most evenings, Cassian sat alone inside his private study, surrounded by shipping manifests, investment ledgers, and glasses of whiskey he poured but rarely finished. Rain battered against the tall windows overlooking the sea, while candles burned low around him. Invitations to royal gatherings, society dinners, and charity galas arrived constantly and piled unopened across his desk, until Hargreaves, his longtime butler, quietly removed them during morning cleaning. 5 years earlier, Cassian had been a different man entirely. Lady Nerissa Blackthorne entered his life during a summer ball in Kensington, and within weeks, London society declared them the most admired couple in England. Nerissa possessed the kind of beauty that silenced ballrooms when she entered. Dark hair swept beneath jeweled pins, porcelain skin, a smile so carefully crafted that it made every person she addressed feel uniquely important. Cassian, who had spent most of his adult life guarded against flattery, found himself disarmed completely. Nerissa seemed to understand him in ways nobody else had attempted. She asked about his shipping ventures with genuine curiosity. She remembered the names of his employees. She brought books to his study on rainy afternoons and read beside him in comfortable silence. For the first time in years, the enormous halls of Ashmore felt less empty. He gifted her jewelry worth a small fortune. He personally financed the restoration of her family's deteriorating country house. He spoke openly before aristocratic society about their future marriage with a certainty that made his mother, Dowager Duchess Arabelle, weep quietly with relief. "She has brought him back to life," Arabelle told close friends during a private dinner. "I had almost given up hope, but beneath Nerissa's warmth lived calculation colder than the North Sea." Unquote. Cassian discovered the truth not through letters or whispered rumors, but through a solicitor's document left carelessly inside Nerissa's writing desk during a visit to her family estate. The document outlined a proposed financial arrangement between Nerissa's father, Lord Blackthorne, and Lord Dashiell Comyn, a rival shipping merchant who had spent years attempting to undermine Renwick trade routes in the Mediterranean. The arrangement was simple. Nerissa would secure the marriage. Once legally bound to Cassian, she would gradually redirect household influence toward investment decisions favoring Comyn's shipping interests. In exchange, the Blackthorne family would receive a permanent share of Comyn's Mediterranean profits. The entire relationship had been a business transaction dressed in silk and perfume. What destroyed Cassian was not merely the betrayal, it was what followed. Before he could confront her privately, Nerissa struck first. She broke off the engagement publicly during a dinner attended by over 200 of London's most prominent families, claiming that Cassian had become emotionally cold and neglectful. Tears glistened beautifully in her eyes as she told sympathetic listeners that she had tried desperately to reach him, but that the Duke of Ashmore was simply incapable of loving anyone. Society believed her immediately. She was beautiful and heartbroken. He was wealthy and silent. The narrative wrote itself. Within days, newspapers printed thinly veiled commentary about the Duke's temperament. Noble women whispered behind opera fans that perhaps the rumors about his coldness were true. Gentlemen at private clubs exchanged knowing glances whenever his name arose. Nerissa moved effortlessly into Lord Comyn's circle within months, confirming what Cassian had discovered but could never publicly prove without exposing himself to further humiliation. He had been betrayed, robbed of his reputation, and left to absorb the blame in silence. The wound cut twice because the world believed he deserved it. After that season, Cassian withdrew almost completely. In quote, he attended only the events his political obligations absolutely required. He spoke to women with careful distance and dismissed every attempt at romantic introduction with responses so measured they bordered on dismissal. Mothers called him impossible. Young women called him frightening. The gossip columns called him the Duke who refused to love. The truth was quieter and far more painful. Cassian no longer trusted that any affection offered to him existed without a transaction hiding behind it. One November evening, Dowager Duchess Arabelle entered his study, carrying a tray of warm broth and bread. She set it beside the fireplace without asking permission and stood watching her son read correspondence by candlelight. "You skipped supper again. I was not hungry. You are never hungry anymore. You are never anything anymore." Cassian did not look up. Arabelle studied his face carefully. The sharpness that had once carried confidence now carried only exhaustion. Lines had deepened around his eyes that did not belong on a man of 36. "She destroyed something in you, Cassian, I see that. But you cannot allow one woman's cruelty to become the rest of your life." He finally looked toward the rain-covered windows. "It was not cruelty, Mother. It was commerce. And I was the only one who did not read the terms." Arabelle pressed her lips together tightly against the grief those words carried. More than anything in the world, she feared her son would spend the remainder of his life alone inside Ashenmoor, surrounded by wealth that meant nothing and silence that meant everything. Several days later, a formal invitation arrived bearing the Greybourne family crest. Lord Everard Greybourne requested the Duke's presence at the engagement celebration of his youngest daughter, Fiora, to Pemberton Hale. Under ordinary circumstances, Cassian would have added it to the unopened pile without a second glance. But Lord Greybourne had recently acquired considerable influence among industrial investors connected to several northern shipping contracts. Cassian needed to secure before the new parliamentary session. Refusing outright could create unnecessary complications. Cassian stared at the invitation for a long time, turning it slowly between his fingers while rain streaked across the dark windows behind him. "You intend to attend, Your Grace?" Hargreaves asked carefully from the doorway. "For one evening," Cassian replied flatly. "Nothing beyond that." The night of Fiora's celebration arrived, wrapped in freezing rain and thick coastal fog that clung to the roads like damp cloth. Servants fastened Cassian's dark coat while horses stamped restlessly outside the manor entrance. Inside the carriage, silence surrounded him completely, except for the steady rhythm of wheels crushing wet gravel beneath iron rims. As the journey wound through the darkened countryside, distant golden light from Greybourne Hall slowly appeared ahead through the curtain of rain. Warm and glowing against the black horizon, like something alive waiting at the end of a long, cold road. Cassian leaned back against the leather seat and stared at nothing. He expected another ballroom filled with flattering smiles and calculated charm, another evening of ambitious mothers positioning their daughters, another performance of affection designed to disguise ambition. He expected nothing real. The carriage wheels ground to a halt before the estate entrance, and somewhere nearby, standing alone in the rain beyond all sight, a woman he had never met was quietly crying. The moment Duke Cassian Renwick stepped through the doors of Greybourne Hall, the atmosphere inside the ballroom changed as though someone had pulled the air from the room and replaced it with something heavier. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Music faltered for half a beat before the violinist recovered. Women straightened their shoulders and adjusted gloves beneath the candlelight, while mothers immediately pulled daughters closer, whispering urgent instructions behind decorated fans. "Stand properly. Smile naturally. Do not appear desperate. The ballroom glittered with golden chandeliers, polished marble floors, and towering flower arrangements wrapped around ivory pillars. Silver trays carried by nervous servants offered champagne, sugared figs, roasted quail on toast, and delicate pastries layered with cream and crushed almonds. At the center of the room, Fiora's diamond ring sparkled brightly as she laughed beside Pemberton Hale. But even her engagement became secondary, the instant Cassian appeared. Lord Everard hurried forward personally to greet him, his voice shifting into the careful warmth reserved exclusively for men whose wealth exceeded his own. Lady Sonara's entire posture transformed with barely contained excitement. Even Ravella and Malus paused their conversation to study the Duke with open interest. Several young noble women attempted conversation almost immediately. One complimented his estates with exaggerated admiration. Another laughed far too loudly at an ordinary remark about the weather. A third mentioned her father's shipping interests with the subtlety of a door left deliberately open. Cassian responded to each with the same measured courtesy. Polite enough to avoid offense, distant enough to close every door before it opened further. His attention wandered across the ballroom without settling on any face, any gown, any smile positioned carefully in his path. Then he heard something. It was faint. Beneath the music, beneath the conversation, beneath the clinking of glasses and the shuffle of dancing shoes across polished marble, a sound most people in the room would never have noticed. Irregular breathing, quick and shallow. Someone trying desperately not to be heard. Cassian's eyes moved toward the far corner of the ballroom where the servants' corridor met the edge of the room. A young serving girl, barely older than 14, had pressed herself against the wall behind a tall flower arrangement. Her tray sat abandoned on the floor beside her. Her hands were shaking violently, while her chest rose and fell in sharp, frightened bursts. She was trying to disappear. Before Cassian could take a step, someone else moved first. Thessaly had been standing near the musicians, occupying her usual position at the invisible edge of the room. The girl was invisible to her eyes, but not to her ears. The ragged breathing cut through the surrounding noise like a single wrong note inside an orchestra, and Thessaly turned toward it immediately. She crossed the space carefully, counting her steps, navigating between guests using the sound of their voices to gauge distance. When she reached the girl, she knelt slowly beside her and spoke in a voice so quiet that Cassian had to strain to hear it from across the room. "Breathe with me. Listen to my voice in slowly. Hold. Out slowly. Again. You are safe. Nobody is watching." The girl's breathing hitched. "I cannot. I dropped the serving tray, and Mrs. Pembury will dismiss me, and I cannot lose this position. Miss, my family depends on. Listen to me. Nothing is broken. I can hear that the glasses are intact by the way they settled against the silver. You stumbled. That is all. Now breathe again with me. Slowly." Thessaly placed one hand gently against the girl's shoulder, while the other found her trembling wrist and held it steadily. 4. Nearly a minute. She breathed audibly enough for the girl to follow the rhythm, guiding her back from panic with nothing except patience and the calm weight of her presence. When the girl's breathing finally steadied, Thessaly helped her stand and pressed the tray carefully back into her hands. "Return through the servants' corridor. Splash cold water on your face. When you come back, nobody will remember anything except the champagne. I promise." The girl whispered something too quiet for anyone but Thessaly to hear, then slipped away through the side corridor. Cassian had not moved. He stood completely still near the center of the ballroom, while guests continued swirling around him, entirely unaware that anything had happened. Something shifted inside his chest that had not moved since the night Narissa destroyed his ability to trust. Every woman in the room had been performing for him all evening, adjusting their beauty, their laughter, their conversation for his benefit. And a blind woman kneeling in the corner had just revealed more genuine character in 60 seconds of quiet kindness than he had witnessed in all the years since his betrayal. For the remainder of the evening, Cassian found himself watching Thessaly constantly. He noticed how she navigated the edges of every room by sound alone. He noticed servants smiling with genuine warmth whenever she passed them. He noticed how her sisters occupied the brightest spaces in every conversation, while Thessaly remained near the walls, listening to everything, participating in nothing, and most painfully, he noticed how her own family treated her. During supper, while guests filled their plates with honeyed lamb, roasted root vegetables, and creamy potato soup, Fiora raised her wineglass proudly. To the Greyborn name, 3 daughters bringing honor through marriage. The number 3 hung in the air like a blade turning slowly. Ravella smirked. Malus tilted her glass in agreement. Several guests glanced toward Thessaly with the careful pity of people who knew they were witnessing cruelty, but felt no obligation to stop it. Thessaly said nothing. Her hands rested in her lap, perfectly still, her sightless eyes fixed on nothing while humiliation pressed silently against her chest. Cassian did not smile. He did not raise his glass. Instead, he placed his napkin beside his plate, pushed his chair backward slowly, and stood. The movement alone silenced the nearest tables. Without hesitation, he walked directly across the ballroom toward Thessaly, while every eye in the room followed him in confusion. He stopped before her chair. The entire ballroom held its breath. "Miss Greyborn, would you honor me with a dance?" Thessaly's lips parted. Heat flooded across her face immediately. She could not see the man standing before her, but she could hear the complete silence surrounding them and understood instantly that something extraordinary was happening. Of course, Your Grace." Her voice nearly failed. Her trembling fingers reached upward until Cassian's hand closed gently around them. His grip was warm and steady, and he guided her to stand with a patience that told her he understood she could not see where she was going. As the orchestra began a waltz, Cassian led her carefully onto the polished floor beneath the chandeliers. Thessaly moved hesitantly at first, clearly overwhelmed by the attention radiating from every direction. "You seem uneasy." "I am unaccustomed to being noticed in a ballroom, and dancing requires trusting someone else's eyes entirely, which I confess is not something I practice often." A faint trace of warmth crossed his expression. "Then trust mine." She did. And unlike every woman who had surrounded him all evening, Thessaly never mentioned his title, his wealth, his estates, or his influence. She could not see his tailored coat, or his polished shoes, or the signet ring on his hand. She spoke instead about the music, about how the violinist slightly rushed the second movement, about how the acoustics in the ballroom changed depending on how many guests were dancing versus standing near the walls. The honesty of her observations unsettled him more deeply than any practiced flattery ever had. Around them, whispers spread between guests with astonishing speed. Why her? He has refused every noblewoman in London. "Did you see her sisters' faces? She cannot even see him. How extraordinary!" By the time the waltz ended, society had already begun talking. And Cassian Renwick, who had spent 5 years refusing to feel anything, realized as he released Thessaly's hand that his chest ached in a way he no longer recognized. After the dance at Fiora's engagement celebration, the Duke of Ashenmore began appearing at Greyborn Hall with a regularity that made servants exchange knowing glances long before the family acknowledged what was happening. His carriage arrived first on a Thursday afternoon, announced only by the sound of wheels on gravel that Thessaly recognized from her sewing room on the 3rd floor. Brinley appeared in the doorway minutes later, slightly breathless. "His Grace is downstairs, miss. He has asked specifically for you." Thessaly's needle stopped mid-stitch. "For me? By name?" She descended the staircase with careful steps while her heart beat so loudly she feared he might hear it before she reached the drawing room. Cassian stood beside the window, turning the moment she entered, and something in the quality of the silence between them told Thessaly that this visit was not a formality. They spoke for 2 hours that first afternoon. He asked about her sewing, And she explained how she distinguished fabrics by weight and texture, how she counted stitches by touch, how she memorized patterns through repetition rather than sight. He listened without interruption, without pity, without the performative amazement she had grown accustomed to from people who treated her abilities as curiosities rather than skills. "May I see your work?" he asked quietly. Nobody outside the servants had ever asked to visit her sewing room. She led him up the narrow staircase, trailing her fingers along the wall while he followed in silence. Inside the small room, Cassian stood motionless, his breath held as though sudden movement might disturb the room. Finished garments hung along one wall. Embroidered fabric panels leaned against the cabinet. A half-completed bodice covered in intricate silver threading sat beside the window. "Your sisters wear these?" "Yes. And they tell people someone else made them." It was not a question. Thessaly did not answer, and the silence said everything. The visits continued. Twice weekly at first, then 3 times, then nearly every other day. Cassian arrived carrying books he read aloud to her beside the garden windows, while afternoon light warmed the glass she could feel but not see. He brought her fabric samples from his shipping imports and watched her identify each one by touch within seconds. He described sunsets to her in language so precise and unhurried that Thessaly once told him he painted with words the way Leander had painted with brushes, and then fell silent immediately, startled by her own honesty. Cassian noticed the name but did not press. Something about the pain in her voice told him that door was not yet ready to open. What surprised him most was how deeply she listened. During one visit, Cassian mentioned a dispute between 2 shipping captains that had consumed his attention for weeks. He described the situation briefly, expecting polite interest at most. Instead, Thessaly asked 3 questions so precisely aimed at the heart of the conflict that Cassian stopped mid-sentence and stared at her in silence. "What is it?" she asked, sensing the pause. "You understood the problem faster than my entire legal counsel. I cannot see people's faces, so I have spent my life listening to what they actually say instead of what they appear to mean. The 2 are rarely identical." He laughed. It was the first genuine laugh he had produced in years, and the sound startled them both. Their walks through the estate gardens became a quiet ritual. Cassian guided her along the gravel paths with her hand resting lightly inside the bend of his arm, and he learned to describe the world around them in ways that mattered to someone who experienced everything through sound, touch, and scent. "The roses are blooming along the east wall. The red ones smell heavier than the white, almost like warm bread with sweetness underneath. And the sky, gray today. The kind of gray that sits low and heavy, like a blanket someone forgot to remove. That is beautiful. It is overcast. The description was beautiful. The weather is irrelevant." He found himself choosing his words more carefully after that. Not because she demanded it, but because she deserved it. Describing the world to Thessaly forced him to see it properly again, after years of deliberate blindness to anything beautiful. One afternoon, while they sat together in the drawing room during a rare hour of quiet, Thessaly asked him something nobody else had dared. "Why did you ask me to dance that night? You could not have known anything about me." Cassian was quiet for several seconds. "I watched you calm a terrified girl when nobody else in the room noticed she existed. And then I watched your family mock you in front of 200 people for the crime of existing without a husband. I decided the ballroom had its judgment entirely reversed." Thessaly pressed her lips together tightly against the emotion those words carried. She turned her face toward the window so he would not see the tears building, though she knew the gesture was meaningless since he could see her perfectly well. "You are doing it again," he said gently. "Doing what?" "Hiding pain. Because someone taught you that showing it was weakness." She could not speak after that. Not because she had nothing to say, but because no one in her life had ever described what she did with such devastating accuracy. Inside the manor, everything shifted. Lord Everard suddenly invited Thessaly to sit nearer important guests during dinners. He asked her opinion during conversations, whenever Cassian visited, and introduced her before wealthy businessmen, as though she had always been valued. Lady Sonara transformed even more dramatically. Expensive gowns arrived weekly from London. Pale blue silk, ivory satin trimmed with lace, embroidered shawls soft enough for Thessaly to feel the quality the moment fabric touched her fingers. "You must wear your hair differently for supper," Lady Sonara insisted one afternoon, adjusting a pearl necklace around Thessaly's throat. "His Grace appreciates refinement." Thessaly barely recognized the tenderness in her mother's hands. 5 years of neglect dissolved into sudden attention, and the warmth felt less like love and more like strategy. Her sisters noticed immediately, and they despised every second of it. Ravella was the first to say it aloud. She sat in the drawing room one rainy afternoon, twisting her wineglass between restless fingers, while Malus and Fioa occupied the chairs beside her. Hadwin had disappeared to London again without explanation, and the strain of pretending her marriage was intact had worn Ravella's composure down to something brittle and dangerous. "She has manipulated him," Ravella muttered bitterly. No powerful man suddenly notices a woman like Thessaly without a reason. She has used her blindness to make herself appear helpless, and men like the Duke cannot resist rescuing broken things. Malus remained quieter, but no less resentful. "She presents herself as humble and selfless. It is a performance, and he has fallen for it because every other woman he has met performed differently." Fiora slammed her teacup against the saucer hard enough to crack the porcelain. "She enjoys this. After years of everyone pitying her, she finally has power over us, and she is savoring every moment. The jealousy poisoned every conversation inside the manor within weeks." Soon whispers began spreading through London society that Thessaly Greyborn had deliberately cultivated vulnerability to entrap the wealthiest duke in England. Ravella encouraged the gossip privately while maintaining innocence before the family. Malus amplified it through carefully worded observations during dinner gatherings, always phrased as concern rather than malice. "I do worry about poor Thessaly. She has become so dependent on His Grace's attention. What happens when he tires of the arrangement?" The phrasing was precise enough to plant doubt, without leaving fingerprints. Hostesses repeated it at tea. Guests carried it between drawing rooms. Within weeks, the whisper had hardened into received wisdom across fashionable London. The blind Greyborn girl was exploiting the Duke's sympathy, and someone really ought to intervene before embarrassment touched respectable families connected to both sides. Thessaly heard fragments of the gossip through servants who tried clumsily to shield her and through conversations that stopped abruptly whenever she entered rooms. Each fragment cut differently. Some wounded her pride. Others wounded something deeper, the fragile belief that Cassian's attention might actually be real. But it was Fiora who escalated the sabotage beyond gossip. During a dinner gathering at Lord Pemberton's London townhouse, Fiora secretly arranged for Lady Nerissa Blackthorne to receive an invitation. Fiora had learned of Nerissa's history with Cassian through society whispers and calculated that the woman's beauty and familiarity might reawaken whatever the Duke had once felt. Nerissa arrived, wearing black silk and sapphires that glittered beneath the chandelier light. Her confidence filled the room the moment she entered, and throughout the evening, she positioned herself near Cassian with practiced precision. She laughed softly at his remarks. She touched his arm while referencing memories from their past. She leaned close enough for her perfume to reach him and murmured, "You were less guarded once. I rather preferred that version of you." Thessaly sat across the room, unable to see what was happening, but able to hear every shift in Cassian's voice. She heard his responses shorten. She heard the slight tension in his breathing whenever Nerissa spoke, and something painful tightened inside her chest, because his expression was hidden from her entirely, and the uncertainty was unbearable. Then Cassian's voice cut through the noise with quiet precision. The version you preferred was the one too foolish to read a solicitor's contract, hidden inside a writing desk. I have improved considerably since then. The silence that followed was devastating. Nerissa's confidence collapsed visibly, and she excused herself from the table within minutes. Fiora stared into her wineglass without moving. Later that evening, Cassian returned unexpectedly to Greybourne Hall after realizing he had left correspondence inside Lord Everard's study. As he walked through the upstairs corridor, raised voices stopped him near the drawing-room door. Ravella's voice carried clearly through the gap. She is embarrassing herself, clinging to him. A blind woman chasing a duke. The entire situation is grotesque. Malus added coldly. Once the novelty wears off, he will move on. Men like Cassian Renwick do not marry women like Thessaly. They admire them briefly and discard them. Fiora laughed sharply. Perhaps once he grows bored, things will finally return to normal, and we can stop pretending she matters. Cassian's jaw tightened until the muscles in his neck became visible. Without hesitation, he pushed the door open. The three sisters froze instantly. The color drained from Ravella's face. Malus set her wineglass down with trembling fingers. Fiora looked as though the floor had opened beneath her chair.
"What exactly?"
Cassian said calmly, his voice controlled but carrying an edge sharp enough to cut glass. "Has Miss Greybourne done to deserve the cruelty of her own family?" Nobody answered. "She has sewn every gown you have worn to every gathering this season. She has organized every celebration inside this household without recognition. She has endured mockery, exclusion, and humiliation from the people who should have protected her, and she has responded to all of it with more dignity and grace than I have witnessed from anyone in this room." Lord Everard, who had appeared in the corridor behind Cassian, stared at the floor without speaking. Lady Sinara pressed a trembling hand against her mouth. "If anyone in this family possessed half the character Thessaly carries silently every single day, this household would deserve the reputation it pretends to have." Then he turned and walked away before anyone could respond. Hours later, Thessaly stood alone beside the darkened garden windows, crying quietly, with her forehead pressed against the cold glass. She had not heard Cassian's confrontation, but the strained silence inside the house told her something had changed. She heard his footsteps approaching and tried to wipe her face, quickly, embarrassed by her own vulnerability. "I heard them," she whispered before he could speak. "Not tonight, but other nights. Many nights. I hear everything in this house, because hearing is all I have left." Cassian stood very still. No one has ever spoken for me before. Not once in my entire life. Something inside Cassian shifted hearing those words. Not the sudden shock of attraction he had felt watching her calm the servant girl. Something deeper. Something that felt permanent. That night, long after his carriage carried him away from Greybourne Hall beneath the black sky, Cassian sat alone in the darkness, holding a small velvet box in his hand. Inside it rested a diamond ring, surrounded by pale sapphires that caught even the faintest light. He had purchased it 9 days ago. He had been waiting for the right moment. But hearing Thessaly's voice break on the words, "No one has ever spoken for me before," had told him the moment was already overdue. The letter arrived at Ashenmore Manor on a gray Tuesday morning. Hargreaves carried it on a silver tray to the study where Cassian sat reviewing shipping contracts. The handwriting on the envelope was uneven and slightly shaky, the strokes of someone who wrote by memory and touch rather than sight. Kroskin recognized it immediately. He opened it with careful hands. The letter was brief. Thessaly's words were measured and deliberate, as though each sentence had been weighed carefully before being committed to paper. She thanked him for his kindness during the preceding weeks. She expressed gratitude for the attention he had shown her family, and acknowledged the honor of his visits. Then, in a passage that made Cassian stop breathing entirely, she wrote that she could not continue accepting his company under false pretenses. She had overheard a conversation between Lady Sinara and Lord Everard 3 nights earlier. Her mother had been discussing the Duke's visits with undisguised satisfaction, and her father had responded with words that carved themselves into Thessaly's chest like letters pressed into hot wax. The man is motivated by political obligation and perhaps a passing fascination with novelty. Do not mistake that for genuine affection. But if his visits benefit the family's position, we should encourage them for as long as they last. Her mother had not disagreed. She had simply asked how best to maintain the arrangement without making Thessaly aware it was temporary. Thessaly wrote that she had survived many forms of cruelty during her life. She had survived mockery, exclusion, invisibility, and the loss of everything she once loved. But she could not survive being someone's act of charity. She had spent 12 years as an object of pity inside her own home, and she would not spend the rest of her life wondering whether the man beside her stayed out of affection or obligation. Pity was the one wound her dignity could not absorb. And if his attention was rooted in duty or curiosity, rather than something real, she would rather end it now while she still had the strength to walk away standing. She wished him well. She asked him not to visit again. The handwriting became unsteady in the final lines, and Cassian could see where tears had worked the paper before the ink dried. Cassian read the letter twice, then a third time. Then he set it on the desk and sat motionless for a very long time, while the fire crackled low and rain streamed endlessly against the windows of Ashenmore. Hargreaves, who had served the Renwick family for over 30 years and rarely spoke unless addressed, paused in the doorway. "Your Grace, forgive the intrusion, but you appear unwell." Cassian's voice was quiet. "She believes I pity her." "And do you, Your Grace, pity her?" Cassian looked toward the window where rain streaked endlessly across the glass. "I have spent 5 years surrounded by women who wanted my title, my fortune, and the influence attached to my name. Thessaly Greyborn is the only woman I have ever met who cannot see any of those things. She speaks to me as though I am simply a man sitting in a room. Not a duke, not an opportunity, just a person." He paused. "She is the only one who ever made that feel like enough." Hargreaves nodded once, slowly. "Then perhaps, Your Grace, she needs to hear precisely that." Cassian looked down at the velvet box resting inside his desk drawer. The sapphires caught the gray morning light and glowed faintly, like something quietly refusing to be extinguished. Downstairs, Arabelle Renwick entered the hallway carrying a folded invitation she had taken the liberty of opening. The annual charity gala at Wiltford House, the largest social event of the winter season. Every noble family in England would attend. She placed the invitation on the study desk without a word and looked at her son with an expression that said everything her voice did not. Cassian stared at the invitation for a long time. The charity gala at Wiltford House blazed with enough wealth and spectacle to rival any royal court. Crystal chandeliers the size of small carriages hung from painted ceilings 30 feet above the ballroom floor, casting fractured golden light across hundreds of guests dressed in silk, satin, velvet, and jewels that flashed from every corner of the enormous hall. Long banquet tables overflowed with roasted swan dressed in herbs, glazed lamb with rosemary and red wine reduction, poached lobster arranged on beds of crushed ice, towers of sugared fruits, imported wines from Bordeaux and Tuscany, and towering desserts wrapped in spun sugar so delicate they trembled when servants carried them past. Diamonds glittered against every throat and wrist, as England's highest nobility gathered beneath one roof. Thessaly Greyborn had never felt more out of place. Lady Sonara had dressed her carefully in pale silver silk that caught the candlelight with every movement. A strand of freshwater pearls rested against her collarbone, while her dark hair was arranged with small pins Thessaly could feel, but not see. She had not wanted to attend. After sending the letter, she had expected silence to follow, and silence had arrived exactly as predicted. No carriage wheels on the gravel, no footsteps in the corridor, no voice reading aloud beside the garden window. The absence hurt worse than any cruelty her sisters had ever spoken. Lady Sonara had insisted on her attendance for appearances. Lord Everard agreed only because certain investors he needed to impress would be present, and withdrawing a daughter from the social season would raise questions he preferred to avoid. So, Thessaly stood near the edge of the ballroom, holding a crystal glass she had not touched, listening to a world she could not see swirl around her in waves of laughter, music, and the rustle of expensive fabric. Ravella noticed her discomfort instantly and exchanged a glance with Malus. He has not arrived. Perhaps tonight she will finally understand her position. Fiora sipped her champagne with quiet satisfaction. It was only a matter of time. Across the ballroom, Lady Nerissa Blackthorn entered, wearing deep emerald velvet trimmed with diamonds that rested against her throat like frozen stars. Conversations shifted toward her beauty immediately as several women stepped aside to watch her move through the crowd. Nerissa's confidence had fully recovered, and her smile carried the certainty of a woman who expected the evening to end in her favor. Then the announcement came. His Grace, Duke Cassian Renwick of Ashenmore. The ballroom's energy shifted violently. Noble women straightened instantly. Mothers seized their daughters' arms with practiced urgency. Fans opened and closed in rapid succession as whispered strategies passed between desperate families positioned along the edges of the dance floor. Cassian entered wearing a dark coat so precisely tailored it made every other man in the room appear slightly disheveled by comparison. His expression carried nothing. No warmth. No interest, no performance of any kind. Women approached him almost immediately. One complimented his political influence. Another praised his shipping empire with breathless enthusiasm. A third positioned herself so close that her perfume reached him before her words did. Nerissa approached last, calm and deliberate, her beauty arranged like a weapon carried openly. "Your Grace, it has been too long." Cassian looked at her briefly. "Not long enough." Then he turned away. Thessaly stood near the far wall, her fingers wrapped around the untouched glass, her sightless eyes directed toward the floor. She expected nothing from the evening except survival. She had already begun counting her steps toward the nearest exit when she heard a change in the ballroom. The music softened, conversations dimmed. The specific quality of silence that meant every person in a room had turned to look at the same thing settled over the crowd like a held breath. Footsteps, steady, deliberate, unhurried, moving through the crowd directly toward her. Thessaly's heart began pounding so hard she could feel it in her fingertips. The footsteps stopped directly before her. Complete silence swallowed the ballroom. 500 guests held their breath beneath the chandeliers. "You sent me a letter," Cassian said quietly. His voice carried just enough to reach the nearest tables and no further. "You asked me not to come. You told me you could survive anything except being pitied." Thessaly's hands trembled against the glass. "I need you to hear something, and I need this entire room to hear it, because you have spent your life being diminished in silence, and you deserve to be valued out loud." A broken breath escaped her lips. Cassian's voice did not waver. "I have spent 5 years being pursued by women who wanted my title, my fortune, and the status attached to my name. Every smile I received was calculated. Every compliment I heard was designed to extract something. I stopped believing that anyone could look at me and see something other than an opportunity." He paused. The silence was absolute. Then I watched a blind woman cross an entire ballroom by sound alone to comfort a terrified servant girl that nobody else even noticed. I watched her kneel on a marble floor in a gown she had sewn with her own hands and calm a stranger's panic with nothing except patience and the sound of her voice. Thessaly's chin trembled violently. I watched her family mock her in front of hundreds of people. I watched her absorb that cruelty without flinching because she had been taught that her pain was an inconvenience to the people who caused it. And I watched her walk back into that same house the next morning and continue sewing gowns for the sisters who laughed at her because her kindness was not a performance. It was who she is. Tears spilled openly down Thessaly's cheeks now. She did not bother hiding them. "You cannot see my title. You cannot see my estates or my wealth or the ring in my hand right now. You speak to me as though I am a man sitting in a room, and that is why I am standing here." He reached forward and took her trembling hand gently. He placed the open velvet box against her palm so she could feel the ring with her own fingers, the way she understood everything. Through touch. "Thessaly, Greyborn, I am not asking you out of pity. I am not asking you out of charity, or obligation, or curiosity. I am asking you because you are the only person who has ever made me believe that being known matters more than being admired." His voice softened to nearly a whisper, but in the perfect silence of the ballroom, every word reached every corner. "Will you honor me by becoming my wife?" A sob broke from Thessaly's chest before she could stop it. Years of humiliation, loneliness, grief, and invisible endurance crashed against her ribs all at once. Her fingers closed around the ring while tears fell openly onto the velvet box, and her trembling hands covered her mouth. She nodded. Then her voice came, broken and barely audible. "Yes!" The word had not finished leaving her lips before applause erupted across the ballroom. Lady Nerissa turned away in humiliation so sharp it was visible from across the room. Whispers exploded through the crowd within seconds. Ravella stared at her sister as though seeing a stranger. Melis pressed a hand against the table to steady herself. Fiora lowered her eyes completely for the first time in her adult life. Lord Everard stood frozen beyond words, but Lady Sinara's expression carried something heavier than shock. Something she had never allowed herself to feel while it might have still mattered. Regret. Genuine, irreversible regret. Years passed after that night, and the name Thessaly Renwick, Duchess of Ashenmore, became known across England for reasons that had nothing to do with wealth or title. As Duchess Thessaly carried the same kindness into her new life that she had carried silently through her old one. She visited hospitals without announcement, sitting beside patients and speaking to them with the same calm warmth she had once given to frightened servants and crying children. She remembered estate workers by name and voice, greeting them during morning walks along the coastal cliffs, with a familiarity that made them feel genuinely seen. She established a foundation, providing employment and education for blind women across northern England, the first of its kind, built not from pity, but from the unshakable belief that capability did not require sight. Ashenmore itself transformed under her presence. The cold stone halls that had once felt like a fortress built to contain grief gradually filled with warmth, music, and laughter. Cashin, who had long since accepted he would grow old inside silence, found himself reading aloud beside the fireplace every evening while Thessaly sewed nearby, her fingers moving steadily across fabric while her expression carried a peace he had never thought possible. People admired the Duchess not because she was powerful, but because her goodness felt entirely genuine. And in drawing rooms across London, the story of the blind seamstress chosen by the Duke who refused every bride in England became the kind of story people told when they wanted to believe that the world occasionally rewarded the right things. Meanwhile, her sister's carefully constructed lives collapsed with the slow inevitability of houses built on unstable ground. Viscount Hadwin's gambling debts destroyed Ravella financially. He disappeared to the continent with another woman, leaving Ravella to face creditors alone inside an estate stripped of nearly everything valuable. The jewels were gone. The silver was gone. The reputation she had once wielded like a weapon crumbled into whispered gossip that followed her through every room she entered. Melis endured a marriage that froze into permanent silence. Lord Dunmore buried himself in political machinations, so consuming that he eventually forgot his wife existed in any meaningful sense. She spent most evenings alone inside enormous rooms that felt emptier with every passing year, and the loneliness she had once mocked in Thessaly became her own daily companion. Fiora's controlling husband grew crueler with each passing season. Pemberton dictated her clothing, her friendships, her movements, and eventually her words, until society itself began whispering about the unhappiness visible behind her carefully maintained smile. The diamond ring she had once pressed against Thessaly's fingers as a weapon of humiliation now felt like a shackle she could not remove. One winter afternoon, years after the gala at Wilford House, 3 familiar carriages arrived outside Ashenmore Manor. They carried women whose expensive gowns were older now, whose faces held exhaustion instead of pride, and whose voices no longer carried the sharp confidence that had once made ballrooms feel dangerous. Inside the grand drawing room, Thessaly received them calmly beside the fireplace, while snow fell softly beyond the tall windows and the sea murmured distantly against the cliffs below. None of her sisters could meet her easily anymore. Wivella's voice trembled when she spoke. Maëlys kept her hands folded tightly in her lap. Fiora stared at the floor with an expression that carried the weight of years spent understanding too late. Thessaly could not see their faces, but she could hear everything. The shame in their breathing, the hesitation before each word, the sound of pride finally setting down a burden it had carried for far too long. She did not punish them. She did not remind them. She did not speak a single word about the years of cruelty they had fed her like bitter medicine disguised as family loyalty. Instead, she offered them tea, warmth, and kindness, because in the end, the greatest victory was never revenge. It was becoming loved for the very heart they once treated as worthless, and England eventually learned what the Greyborn family discovered far too late, that real love and true worth were never found in beauty, status, or sight, but in loyalty, kindness, and the quiet, unbreakable strength of a heart that refused to become cruel, despite every reason the world gave it.